in terms of introducing our speaker, David Giffels, it's kind of like, what can we say? He's sort of Akron's son.
The Kinks? You didn't have a Devo record? Wow, thanks so much for coming. It's amazing. You know what's crazy? Do you know what's going on at Musica right now? What's going on? What? There's a big book launch party for a new Akron book going on at Musica right now, for this book called A is for Akron that my friends Karen Starr and Joanna Wilson just put out. Like, when did it become a thing where there's two competing, like, big book launch events for books about Akron on the same night? I say we skip the reading and we go over there and we kick their ass. It's like the Crips and the Bloods of Akron literary scene. So this is weird. This will be probably the weirdest reading I do. It's going to be much easier in places like Pittsburgh, where I have to explain us, and Cleveland, where I have to explain us even harder. You're the choir. But it's true. I mean, there's, I was thinking today, there's this line in one of the early essays in the book where I refer to the fact that when, you know how when somebody tells you that they've recently moved to Akron, you know what you always say in response? Why? I know. You do that too. I know. That's why I don't have to explain this. You do. Like, you say why, and you know exactly what that means. It's not like, why would anybody want to move to Akron? It's like, how did you find out about this? Like, how did you know it was good? Because that's kind of like the instinct of the whole book. Is like, how did, I know it's good, and a lot of people don't, so that seems like a good reason to write a book about it. But, you already get it. So it really made, it makes my job easy tonight, because, when I go to certain places, I'm trying to find a piece to read that will explain us, or that will reflect on a larger cultural truth, or that will, sort of seem literary. But here, I just get to read the one that was the most fun to write. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to read it, and then we'll just talk. I'll let you ask questions about anything, and I'll answer them if I want to. So this is an essay about my first job. There really was no other way to deal with the situation than to look the tall, naked black man directly in the eye. He wanted a hot dog. I couldn't just ignore him. In a situation like that, the best option is to go with direct, locked-on, no gaze-wandering eye contact. Even so, for a preternaturally shy 17-year-old who still had trouble with any public encounter that involved anything other than pretending to be somewhere else, this was going to be a challenge. Add to this the fact that I had very little actual contact with any black people in my mostly sheltered lifetime, nor with naked people in general, and my discomfort was as urgent as it was complex. "Mustard?" I asked. He reached into the long fur coat hanging in his wooden stall and pulled out a handful of bills. I tried not to glance down at the money, keeping my eyes focused on his, even though his hardly seemed aware that I existed. He may well have been famous. I didn't know. Among my many professional liabilities was the fact that I was, and probably remained, the only employee in the history of the National Basketball Association who didn't actually know anything about basketball, nor about basketball players, nor the sport's emergent cultural importance, nor any of the basic rules or techniques of the game. I was a Cleveland Cavaliers ball boy who possessed no intrinsic loyalty to the home team, and who, most nights, was more interested in the contents of the Gatorade bucket than the presence of Larry Bird or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the visitors' locker room. I identified Abdul-Jabbar as the guy with the goggles. and Bird as the guy who really should reconsider that mustache. I did have a certain fascination for Cornbread Maxwell, but only because he had a cool name and he seemed like a nice person. But then the same could be said of my English teacher, Sister Noel. It had nothing to do with talent or fame. Those things were lost on me. Some guys would give you exactly what it costs to go buy them a hot dog, and some would give you a random handful of crumpled bills and tell you to keep the change. This was usually how I reckoned which ones were famous and which ones were not. In this case, I wasn't aware of how much I had been handed, because to have looked down at the cash would have been to risk seeing more than my teenage inadequate self could bear. So I quickly closed my fingers over the money and turned to leave. "Hey kid, how much did I give you?" I looked into my hand and turned sideways toward the floor. "5? Get me 2. Under any circumstance, I suppose being a ball boy for an NBA team is an unusual first job. I wasn't aware of that then, in as much as no teenager is aware of the unusualness of his life until other people start to point it out to him, a bittersweet gift that so far had not been granted to me. It was a job. I was paid $15 and 2 complimentary tickets per game. Because the tickets often went unused, I didn't consider them part of my compensation package. I did, however, value the half-used rolls of athletic tape I often scrounged from the trainer's room floor. With better adhesion than masking tape, it was useful for hanging posters on my bedroom wall. Even on the most humid Ohio summer nights, James Dean and the police stayed put. The main focus of my work was to touch nothing. This seemed the only prudent approach to a working life in a room full of physically superior men who were naked about 40% of the time, whose own sense of their body was at once primitive and evolved, the floor around them littered with the ubiquity of their constantly changing shells, from street clothes to ankle wraps, to uniforms, to sweats, to showers, to towels, to ice packs, to street clothes again, sweat-soaked socks and sodden jock straps, unraveled bandages and spent towels, satiny uniforms stewing in the funk of blood, snot, pasty perspiration, and mid-shelf cologne. There was another kid who seemed positively charged by this atmosphere, who walked through the locker room gathering great handfuls of socks and jocks, a term he used as though he was the maitre d' and it was the house specialty. He had a habit of tapping players' bottoms with all the cheerful encouragement of a father teaching his son to ride a bike, and calling them either by their known nicknames or by the impromptu handles that came to him on the wings of some locker room muse. Bingo, AC, footsie, sweets. I had learned to keep my fingernails on the long side so that when I did have to pick anything up that was dropped on the floor, I could use them as a set of tweezers, keeping to a minimum the contact between my own skin's surface and that of another man's intimate apparel. Look, I'll just come right out and say it. I once witnessed a 7-foot center trying to pop the pimples on his own back, a physically difficult task even for a gifted professional athlete. If it doesn't leave the room, it was Bill Lambier. My perspective on the entire matter of my employment was cast. Here's where it gets really Cleveland. Akron. I knew I was surrounded by absurdity, but I may have been the only member of the organization with absolutely no context for how profound the situation actually was. I wasn't aware that I had happened into one of the most deranged and downtrodden locker rooms in the history of the NBA, that of the early 1980s Cleveland Cavaliers. I wasn't aware that the team was on its way toward the longest losing streak in NBA history, 24 games. I should point out, though, in the sake of fairness, that that record was finally broken in 2011, some 30 years later. by the Cleveland Cavaliers. I wasn't aware that it was unusual for only 2,000 fans to show up for a pro basketball game in a 20,000-seat arena. Nor did I recognize that my boss, Ted Stepien, a fleshy millionaire with a long, sparse comb-over, oversized squarish glasses, and a nasal whine that sounded like milk curdling, was considered by many to be the worst owner of any franchise in the history of American professional athletics. He gained sports immortality by virtue of the NBA's Stepien rule, which limits an owner's ability to trade first-round draft picks. By the time this emergency legislation was instituted by league officials, Stepien had given away nearly a decade's worth of first-rounders, offering them like shore leave cash for whatever journeyman happened to be available. His approach to catching lightning in a bottle, it seemed, was to fling the bottles wildly off a cliff. So I knew my situation was odd, but it had nothing to do with any of that. I knew my situation was odd because I was aware enough to know something was going on that I couldn't understand, but not aware enough to know what it was. This, incidentally, is a very good description of what it feels like to be 17 years old. Even among all those notable misfits, I was an outsider. Where others were baffled by the then lavish $700,000 salaries the owner was paying to the likes of James Edwards and Scott Wedman, I was confounded by this 3 seconds Mr. Stepien was constantly carping about from his floor seat behind the basket. For all the problems of his franchise, this rule restricting how long an offensive player could stand in the free throw lane seemed to be the singular thing Stepien cared about, or even knew about. 3 seconds! Hey, 3 seconds on that guy! Come on, 3 seconds! Stepien, who not only sat in on halftime meetings, but also sometimes tried to diagram plays, to the bewilderment of almost everyone else, went through 4 coaches in a single season. One of them, Chuck Daly, celebrated his firing with champagne. Stepien predicted Daly would never again have such an opportunity as he'd been offered in Cleveland. Daly almost immediately established a dynasty as coach of the Detroit Pistons and is now in the Basketball Hall of Fame. To me, that hyperactive rate of turnover was the definition of normal. I saw players and team employees come and go with the frequency of courthouse pigeons. By the time the 3rd coach arrived, I just took it as a given that his days were numbered. I was far more intrigued by the way that brand new sneakers piled up in the dressing room trash cans after games. Players undressed and just threw their sneakers into the garbage. Perfectly good leather Converse and Nikes. If only I wore a size 13. Even to my perspective, which was something like that of a French Revolution time traveler who found himself suddenly in an episode of Miami Vice, there was a clear, profoundly paradoxical moral conflict between the frugality and wastefulness in the locker room. While the wastebaskets filled up with $100 shoes, the refrigerator was stocked with post-game food provided for the players, soggy, low-rent sandwiches, chip chop and ham salad and the like, hand-wrapped in cellophane. Even as the owner threw lucrative contracts to the likes of an aging Bobby Wilkerson, the equipment guy had to reuse the name banners sewn to the backs of the uniforms. When Dave Robish was unloaded from the team, the trainer's assistant carefully unstitched the panel and on its blank reverse side ironed the synthetic letters of the new guy's surname, Calvin. I still have that piece of cloth. I stole it. Like Mac Calvin and Dave Robish are going to be famous enough someday that I could sell that on eBay. This tension grew as it became more and more clear that the team was in deep financial trouble. There were rumors that the astronomical payroll wasn't being met. We ball boys hadn't been paid in weeks, and because I recently had been named head ball boy, a promotion that was at best titular, the others were pressuring me to speak up on their behalf, which made me uncomfortable for many reasons. He fired Joe Tate. What? He did. He fired Tate. No way. Yeah, way. Even I knew this was huge. Joe Tate was the radio announcer for the Cavs, the only one they'd ever had, and to say he was the voice of the team is only a flimsy metaphoric cliche. He kind of was the team. My brother had an album of season audio highlights issued after the Miracle in Richfield year, 1976. In our sports universe, this is what constituted a miracle. The Cavaliers made the playoffs. They lost in the conference finals, but that didn't stop the legend, especially with Tate's modulated Midwestern twang providing the narration. Tate was the perfect voice for hard-bitten sports town, a decidedly unfancy man in a decidedly unfancy place. Devoid of modifiers and metaphors and unwilling to spin tall men into legends, he served his descriptions straight. He had only two catchphrases, wham with the right hand, and have a good night, everybody. That's as good as my dialects get. Come on. One meat, the other potatoes. Most of that album is a collage of Tate calling the action in a voice that sounds like an uncanny chamber quartet. Bugle, trombone, bassoon, and kettle drum. And the whole thing comes to a climax in one of the greatest play-by-play ejaculations I've ever heard. Anyone who has lived in Northeast Ohio for the past generation knows the call. Bingo on the run, the gun, he shoots, no good, rebound, Clemens, score! Because of the distorted euphoria of that final syllable, there are still circles of local conspiracy theorists who believe Tate is not actually bellowing, score, but is actually screaming, fuck! In uncontrolled celebration, a theory that seems to be more a projection of desire. We want those who deliver our news to share our response to it than plausible possibility. We all knew Tate from the press room, a great big man in a sweater, unassuming but also by nature commanding. He would acknowledge us, which was a particular demarcation. There were those who recognized you were there and those who did not. Tate recognized us. So when word spread through the ball boy ranks that the man commonly referred to as the voice of God had been canned by Mr. Stepien, it was like hearing the president had been shot. The story we heard was that Tate had said something during one of the game broadcasts critical of Stepien, something that was almost impossible to avoid even in an objective account of any given day. Stepien would soon explain away the firing, telling reporters that announcers are, quote, a dime a dozen. Joe Tate was reinstated after Stepien, having lost $15 million in 3 seasons, sold the team in 1983. Tate remained the voice of the Cavaliers until 2011 and is in the Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Only one person seemed to openly recognize the absurdity of our collective situation. That was Don Ford, a bench sitter who averaged 1.1 points and 9.6 minutes a game in the 1981-82 season. Ford had arrived from the Los Angeles Lakers in a players and picks deal that included, naturally, a swap of first-rounders. The Lakers received the Cavs' 1982 first-round pick, which they used to draft James Worthy, who almost immediately became a superstar and is now in the Basketball Hall of Fame. The Cavs received the Lakers' 1980 first-round pick, which they used to draft Chad Kinch, who... You laugh as though you've heard of him. Who played in 41 games of professional basketball and was out of the NBA after 1 season. It's like you couldn't try hard and do it that way. Don Ford was pretty much the opposite of everyone I'd ever known. A handsome, lanky surfer type from Santa Barbara with longish blonde hair and a wry self-awareness. While his teammates spent their pregame hours getting treatment for sore joints and injuries, or reviewing stats, or clumsily insulting one another, Ford just sort of elaborately hung out. People People whose entire lives have been defined by what they do with their bodies, athletes, cowboys, strippers, and so on, tend to have very specific physical personalities. The basketball players I saw each exuded this dynamic. The big men expressed their bigness in every gesture, in the way, for instance, they pulled the snaps loose on their warm-up pants as though they were Vikings shaking out the broad sails. The point guards had a nimble precision even in the way they ate their post-game chip-chop sandwiches. Don Ford, however, was the only player I knew whose physical personality was one of expert relaxation. Even when he was on the court, he was loose and windblown. One of my duties was to bring basketballs around the dressing room to be signed by all the team members. Everyone had his own curly-cued scrawl, perfected over the years into nonchalance. Ford did too, but he always added a little hipster dash, sometimes signing Disco Don Ford or Devo Don Ford. He was the only player. Devo was famous for 1 minute. That was it. He was the only player who ever dressed me with what seemed like genuine interest. I didn't resent the others for their own demeanors, which resided generally in the regions of distraction, disinterest, and dismay. Although I never came to understand the game they played for a living, I did come to understand the effects of their existence within it, something people rarely get to see even in our era of deeply intense celebrity fascination. I came to understand the way public people create, by necessity, a force field of self-preservation. I saw what it was like for them not even to be able to step from the shower into a towel without someone coming up to ask for something, an interview, an autograph, a basketball to be signed. It's a skewed survival technique, to have to shield yourself from adoration. Realness, for them, had to be achieved through an artificial process. That's why Don Ford seemed unique, because he seemed entirely real, aware not only of his own place in the world, but the places of those around him. Ford would ask me questions, just small talk about school or my family, or even half joking what I thought of the team's chances that night. I would stiffen up and hate myself for not being able to answer his question, just to be like him, cool and casual, knowing. He seemed aware that we were all losers by association, and it wasn't the worst thing in the world. In an interview one time, he referred to his team as the Cleveland Cadavers. The local media picked up on it, and a new nickname took hold, the Cadavaliers. I know. And it got worse, too. like they're worse now than they were then. One night, Ford sat looking at his game check, leaning way back in the chair in front of his wooden locker stall. He wouldn't be with the team much longer. Everyone knew that at some level. But he had another year guaranteed on his contract. Mr. Stepian's going to pay me to sit on the beach for a year, he said in a way that could only be described as cavalier. I knew what a cavalier was. I'd devoted a great deal of my youth to reading about people who carried swords and wore capes and feathers and rode horses. As a result, I had yet another question about this enigmatic organization that employed me. My emergent sense of place told me I lived in a region fiercely proud of its grittiness and its blue-collar sensibilities and its disdain for foppishness and pretense. Even though the Cavaliers didn't actually play in Cleveland, they played in a cold, rigid concrete tank called the Coliseum, another curious non sequitur. In a rural suburb called Richfield, they were Cleveland's team, and I knew Cleveland as a city with a tall, flaming black steel factory smokestack. None of this evoked the gallantry of the Cavaliers I knew from books. Other teams in the region had names like Browns, because the first coach was a hard-nosed genius named Brown, and because brown is the color of mud and dried blood. And Steelers, because steel is made here in beer cans and Camaro rims are made of steel. And Indians, because we have a wooden ear in matters of cultural sensitivity. Why Cleveland's basketball team would be called the Cavaliers remains almost as much a mystery to me as the 3-second rule. Ted Stepien did not name the team. That was done a decade before when Cleveland entered the league. And to his credit, he did have a knack not only for marketing. He'd made his fortune as founder of nationwide advertising services, but specifically for marketing to the sort of sports fans who comprised the Northeast Ohio sports consumption market. He adopted a polka for the team's fight song. At one end of the floor, dressed in tube tops, short shorts, and pantyhose, he installed the teddy bears, vampish cheerleaders that were the owner's namesake, which gave the whole arrangement a daddy-daughter creepiness. Over on one side of the court was Superfan, a sort of everyman slob cheerleader whose gut bounced inside a too-tight black t-shirt and whose gimmick was tearing apart beer cans with his teeth. We had not been paid in more than a month, and some of the ball boys were pestering the trainer who oversaw us to do something. But what could he do? Rumors were spreading through the locker room and the cavernous back hallways of the Coliseum that no one was getting paid. Even if that was true, we all understood that this was not an organization with any discernible justice system, or, for that matter, any discernible system at all. Things just sort of happened, or they didn't. All I knew was that whatever money was on the table was not worth the growing pressure from my colleagues to exert my head ball boy authority. Even if I was to make a stand, I didn't have a clue where to make it, nor to whom, nor how stands were made at all. I'd never been righteous a day in my life. One of the other ball boys latched on to me as we went through our pregame duties, hauling buckets of ice into the locker room, helping the trainer set up his cart, distributing towels, folding warm-up suits, avoiding staph infections, etc. Stepien always hangs around courtside at halftime, he said. Let's ask him. Ask him what? For our checks. We can't do that. Sure we can. It's our money. It's only right. I wanted to believe this was true, but being right justified doing something that seemed entirely wrong. But I didn't believe that. The problem was that I wasn't entirely clear about what I believed about anything, and this is how I found myself at halftime, when I should have been dust mopping my end of the court, instead approaching Ted Stepien, who stood talking to another man in a suit. Mr. Stepien? He turned those big square glasses in my direction. I was just wondering if you could tell us when the ball boys were going to get paid? When I arrived for work the next night, the trainer called me into the back room. What were you thinking? I couldn't answer, partly because of the lump rising in my throat, but mostly because the question was its own answer. What was I thinking? I think I wasn't thinking. I knew what was coming next. I'd been fired. Stepien had just finished screaming at the trainer how he'd been embarrassed by some ball boy who he didn't ever want to see in the building again. I didn't argue. I left, making my way back through the locker room. A few players were already there, easing into another miserable night. Big, long, misshapen men, half in street clothes and half out, stretching overtaxed knees and pulling cricks from their necks, preparing themselves to be beaten once more. I exited through the back door toward the parking lot. There, in the first row, was Mr. Stepien's big shiny car. One of the great things about writing memoir is that the statute of limitation passes on certain things. I slowed. I looked behind me. Then I walked toward the car, at first not sure what I was about to do, then with an idea, then something like conviction. I picked up my stride, and when I got to the car, I reached out for the driver's door handle, gave it a yank, and kept on walking, the car alarm blaring its nonsense with undue urgency. 3 seconds, 3 seconds, 3 seconds. So, thank you. Thank you. And before I take a question, I just really, really want to thank the Akron-Summit County Public Library, not just for having me tonight, but for this awesome series that they run, which is very hard for them to put on. It costs them money that they don't have. It costs them logistics that are, done by people who have other things to do in their very busy lives. Bob Ethington runs this series. He's done an amazing job. I know. Because of him, I and maybe many of you were here the night Amy Sedaris had a line wrapping all the way around the building. I saw Grail Marcus here and got to have a martini with him afterwards and talk about the Doors. I mean, so many, Dave Eggers and Anne Lamott and on and on. Chuck D was in the freaking Akron Library talking in an intellectual fashion. And also, David Jennings, the director, and Michael Durr, who handled so much of the logistics of everything, and the Friends of the Library, and all of the people I haven't mentioned. So just thank you guys. And I have to tell you, like, a slightly poignant story about tonight. This is the last time that one of these main events is going to get to happen at 7 o'clock, which is a really good time for a program like this, because the state funding has been cut and the library's had to cut its hours. We got to do it tonight at 7 because it was booked last year, so we were grandfathered. But from now on, it seems like a small thing, but it's an erosion of what we've come to enjoy culturally that we're given by people who really care, and that's being taken away in little bits and pieces by people who don't really care. So, thank them on your way out and support them and support the levies. And if you see your legislator or your governor, tell them we need universities and libraries. They're important. So. So, ask me a question. Someone here in the middle. Yeah. You're sort of in the middle. That's good. The one that somebody's about to pay money for. Energy behind getting this book published as the book that I wanted it to be, which was a book of essays about the Rust Belt, which is, book of essays is kind of a poisonous term in New York publishing, and Rust Belt is kind of something they're like, what's that? Is that the thing that you wear that matches your rust shoes during Fashion Week? But because my agent was really, behind it and supportive, and because we found a publisher, Scribner, that actually wanted it specifically as a book of essays about the Rust Belt, it was really like a matter, in some ways, of pride to be able to say that this is our story and that it's relevant enough for someone to publish it. So it was fun to write in that way, and also fun, that stuff of explaining us to other people is always fun for me. So you had a question too? Yes. Gosh, you're asking all these superlative questions like it's never that simple. Which was the hardest? Which one was the hardest to write? I don't know, man. They're all hard. Writing's hard. Explains us because we understand LeBron James in a unique way, and in a complex way, and it's a way that says a lot about us. LeBron James was born almost exactly the same moment the term Rust Belt was born, in what I think of as the quintessential Rust Belt city, one of the first cities to become what those cities were. And so he grew up as entirely as like an experiencer of that place. And we know that, but the rest of the world doesn't quite connect with it that way. So I wanted to try to write about why his departure hurt so bad and why it was so meaningful here, and it didn't have that much to do with basketball. So that essay is very little about basketball. And also why his coming back here would mean something different than just the simple superficial story of the hometown player coming back to his team and being the champion. So it was hard to make that balance, I guess, is the answer. Yes, the gentleman in the front who happens to be my dad.
You dedicated the book to John Giffels. Would you tell us a little bit why and what influence he had on the book?
Yeah, you did that? Yeah, there's a recurring... the question is, the book is dedicated to my friend John Puglia, who's a recurring character, real-life character in the book, and why it's dedicated to him and what he means to the book. Well, John was my best friend from, kind of high school through college and onward, and we came of age in Akron as college students that you could just leave the University of Akron campus, which was then called Akron U, and go down into a downtown that was like a set from the movie Mad Max. It was just this abandoned, decrepit, decadent wasteland that didn't seem like anything but beauty and possibility. And John was an artist and I was a writer, so we're going to write about this and make art about this, and it's all ours. Nobody else wants it anymore. And all kinds of things were happening downtown then. The Bank nightclub that I wrote about was in an actual bank building, this opulent, abandoned bank building, and it was a rock and roll club, and all this stuff that just seemed, too good to be true. And then he and I got married at the same time and started our families and bought old houses around the same time and both started our careers here. And soon, eventually, his story is so important to me because he and I validated what it means to commit to a place that a lot of other people say is not worth committing to. In John's and my lifetime, we were born in the same year, Akron lost a third of its population. We watched friend after friend leave town for either better opportunities or because it just didn't seem like they could make it here. And so for us to continue to be able to do all the things we wanted to do here, for him to make art, and he opened galleries in the old B.F. Goodrich complex, and for me to write about it, and for us to do that together, we sort of validated each other and we encouraged each other, and he influenced so much about the way I think about my place and my life and the world and art. And, and this, the older we got, the more aware we were of this and the more we talked about it. And he was a constant in the writing of this book. I interviewed him. He gave me research materials. I traded stories with him. And so he became almost like a collaborator on this book. And so John got sick and died of cancer last summer. And so that's why, it's hard to talk about, but it's also very important. I mean, for that to happen 9 months ago, eight or 9 months ago, and still to be grieving your best friend who was much too young to die that way, but also to know that, by fate, I guess, this document can come out and be a celebration of him is really great. And also, a reason to remember why you pay tribute to those people and why you carry their stories forward. So, yeah. Thanks, Dad. So, I want to read you the dedication. It's for John Puglia, who always ventured first. And I'll tell you a really quick story. One of the times he ventured first, we broke into the old B.F. Goodrich factory, the great big one, Building 41 at the corner, and we got all the way up to the top floor, and we were going through, it was dark, it was nighttime, of course, and we'd been drinking, and so he's walking, and all of a sudden I scream, "John, stop!" And he's like, "Why?" And I looked, I had seen what he didn't see. There was an elevator shaft, an open elevator shaft right in front of him. So yeah, his sons believe this sort of myth that I saved his life. So yeah, so he always ventured first, sometimes for good and sometimes not so good. So down here.
I once went to California, Malibu. I was on the trolley. Have you ever been there on the trolley that goes up to the J. Paul Getty Museum? It's a very refined museum. It's absolutely beautiful. They were starting a conversation with these two women, because I'm from Carney, do that. And he said, "You have an accent. Where are you from?" And I looked at them like they were crazy, but okay. And I told them where I was from. I said I was from Akron. And they said, "Oh, do you have running water there?"
Oh, wow.
How do you plan? I'm going to places like Malibu. I'm guessing I'm making it very grandiose. But and tell people from Akron that how we have running water and how much longer than you did.
Yeah, Californians are stupid too. This is the question is this is somebody who went to Malibu and said that she was from Akron, and the question was, do you have running water there? And how do I? So it's funny. Like I have my publicist at Scribner, at the publisher, is originally from Mansfield, and she's this very beautiful, sophisticated, confident young lady, and working in New York media circles and all that. And she said one time, somebody said, "You're from Mansfield, Ohio. Like, did you get fashion magazines on the farm?" like because she dresses well, and she's like, "Mansfield is not farms," Like she didn't know how to answer. I don't know how to answer that question. And I guess writing this book. Like one of the things I mentioned somewhere in the book is we sometimes get confused with Iowa because they both start with O and they have 4 letters, and they're in a part of the country that all seems like the same part of the country, which is, the term flyover seems like it's worn out, but it's not, because you still get that a lot, yeah. Except there's a quote that I really love from the writer Don Powell. All Americans come from Ohio, even if only briefly. So I think we are, we're what it is. Over here. Yeah, the question is, if I do go someplace like California, is there one essay that I would pull out of here that I would say explains what Akron is? And, kind of. I mean, none of them were, I guess none of them were sort of overt, because that almost seems defensive. Not that we're not a defensive people. We are. This is who we are. And also, it seemed like it would be kind of overplaying the intent to directly do that. So, but I did, like, the second essay in the book is the last one I wrote, and it was kind of my editor and I were talking about, we wanted to make sure that certain things were established, that what does it mean, not just to be from Akron, but to be from the post-industrial part of America that's just now kind of coming into its own definition as something that's no longer industrial. And so that's what that essay's intent was. But there's an essay titled "Do Not Cry for Me, Arizona," rather than Argentina, which is to say, which is an essay that kind of does, like to me, I say this a lot, if I try to think of that which is not Akron, it's Phoenix. Like everything that Phoenix is, we're not, and everything that we are, Phoenix is. We have bowling, they have golf, we have humidity, they have dry heat. We have a team called the Browns, they have a team called the Suns. And our population in Akron has gone from just 290,000 in 1960 to 199,000 in 2010. Phoenix's population has gone from 400,000 in 1960 to 1.4 million in 2010. And my theory is that entire million people all came from Akron. So that essay kind of tries to put it in that reversal of you. Over in the hallway. The question is if I ever had any inspiration to write an essay about Thursday's Lounge, and what was it? Yeah, because it was like a big kind of hotbed of new wave and kind of 80s alternative dance music. The problem is, like, I remember very little of the times I was at Thursday Lounge, which was a whole lot of times. I mean, there's a lot of music. There's a lot of rock and roll in this book because that's just kind of part of, I think, our experience, and because we are a kind of a unique rock and roll city and region, Akron and Cleveland, and Canton too, and Kent, and New Philadelphia. This whole Northeast Ohio, Youngstown, of course. So there's a lot of that in there, and in fact, there's an essay that just came out today in Scene magazine called House Rockers about the weird phenomenon of Michael Stanley, who's like a major rock star, all the way up to the edge of Cuyahoga County, and then nobody's ever heard of him. I mean, the great thing about rock and roll fans is that they experience it in a specific moment in their life that's meaningful. Like my moment's just a little bit earlier, and then Thursday's moment is something that people remember with fond nostalgia and also with cultural significance, and the Lime Spider, which was downtown, which is now the Lockview, and so forth, and that's where the Black Keys came from, and so all these stories kind of fold one over into the other and hopefully continue. I mean, one of the things I've always said about Akron is Akron has everything, but it only has one of everything. So there's always only been one rock club in Akron, but there's never not been one, even if we had to make one up in a VFW hall or something. Yeah.
Would you encourage your children to stay in Akron?
Would I encourage my children to stay in Akron? Yes, absolutely I would. Yeah, I really don't want them to leave. I mean, I would encourage them to go off into the world too. And I hope they do both. Can they do both? I don't know yet. I hope they do. I mean, I hope that Akron is where they would want to kind of, blossom. I hope they would go see the world and get kicked around a little bit in that, but ultimately come back. And then the other part of me that's telling the truth is that I never want them to leave the house. So, except on certain days. But so, oh yes, that's fine.
And don't forget, there is a third book about Akron.
Yeah, there's 3 books about. This is so freaking crazy. There's 3 books about Akron that just came out. Dave Lieberth wrote this book called what's it? Do you know the Industrious? And I can't think of the title right now, but it's this beautiful coffee table book. Like all this money is being spent in the publishing industry on Akron, that seems ridiculous.
So my question is,
Yes.
what ended up on the cutting room floor? What's still in the file? Do you have a story or an anecdote that you wish you could have squeezed that one out of you?
A lot, because this book I worked on this book for 5 years, and it went through like a lot of permutations. Wow, what's on there? There's a lot on the cutting room floor. I mean, I don't think there are any stories that are worth retelling that aren't in here, that are about Akron or about this theme of the Rust Belt and so forth. But there's pieces all over the place. Yeah. So sorry. Yes, sir.
So you've lived in West Akron a lot longer than I have. I moved here 7 years ago. And I was wondering, when you see all the progress in that area, in our part of town, are you amazed with how far it's come? Or are you kind of wondering what's taken so long for it to get there?
The question is, I've lived in West Akron longer than he has, and so I've seen the changes and the sort of the tending that's taken place, and what's taken so long, or I don't know if it's taken so long, because I mean, I have a distinct memory. One of my high school jobs after I got fired by Ted Stepien was as a landscaper, and this guy had a contract to replant devil strips. After we call them devil strips. After, you don't know that, do you? Yeah, of course you do. Yeah, I think it's in A as for Akron under D. We had this job, like replanting a bunch of devil strips in Highland Square, and I was young, and I didn't live in that neighborhood yet, but I loved that neighborhood. I was always fascinated by it, and it always seemed really interesting to me, and had all these old houses that were really neat. And I was really aware, as we would work our way down the sidewalk, on this slow pace, that each house on the streets we were working on was somebody was there taking care of it. Like it would take long enough to plan a devil strip that you would get to know what was going on with that house that summer, and somebody was always doing something. And so I was aware at this very young age that, you're asking specifically about West Akron, Highland Square, that was a place that people were taking care of. And I'm sure I didn't think this consciously at the time, because teenagers are subconscious, preconscious. But I became aware that there was this like communal, like all hands on deck kind of thing. And that's really like the title, The Hard Way on Purpose, is it would have been much easier for those people to move to Stowe. And Stowe's great. I mean, but to a house that was newer and needed less of that kind of care, because you have to scrape all the old alligator paint off of every single house in Highland Square, and you have to do a lot more work. But there was something about it that was making that neighborhood feel like organically remade, and that's really, I was talking to an interviewer last week, and he said, is there one thing that you would say is the defining quality of the Rust Belt now? And I said, yeah, I think it's this idea of remaking, of reinvention, because so much of what we lived through in that generation of hard times is this notion of, you either leave, as many did, or you stay and you commit to helping it come back. And these are places that were built on innovation, and then to see that innovation kind of churn under, there's still, I think, that same like spirit of innovation, reinvention, recycling. Nothing goes to waste. Like one of the things my friend John taught me, being around him and a lot of artists, visual artists, is that so much of the art that I knew in the 1980s and 1990s especially was made out of junk, like industrial urban junk, because it was everywhere. You could just pick it up, and they would make beautiful things out of it. And that's what we do. And it's, in Phoenix, you don't have to do that. You just pay a big mortgage and you get fake grass. It's all done for you. It's so easy. And I think they just hook an oxygen tube to you. You don't have to breathe there. Oh no, is anybody in the audience from Phoenix? Okay, it's a safe place. Those people over at Musica, they're all from Phoenix. I'm just saying. Yes, over here. Oh, hey, Gavin. How are you? Gavin points out that I used to play in a band called The Difficult, and I have a book called The Hard Way on Purpose. What are you going to do when it gets easy in Akron? I feel like that's a better question that I could give an answer to. I don't know. I'll move to Phoenix. In the back, yes.
How's the house coming?
How's the house coming? I don't know. I never have time to work on it anymore. No, she's referring to my last book, which was about reclaiming a decrepit old house in Akron that was going to be condemned, which is The Hard Way on Purpose. Kind of, it's constant work, like every house in Akron, I think, and it's better than it used to be, but it still has bats. Sorry. What?
There's no bats, you're lucky.
If there's no bats, I'm lucky.
There are no bats, you're lucky.
There are no bats, I'm lucky. I don't get it. Huh? There are bats, though, Michael. Oh, yes, over here.
I got a special request that came 1,200 miles away from an ex-Akron. And you know all the local authors. I have a list of names I have to check to see Ohio.com. There's the obituary, or they're old friends from Akron, from this ex-patriot. Anyway, has a book ever been written about the trucking industry in Akron? You know of?
So the question is, has a book ever been written about the trucking industry? Actually, Roadway, although it was a company-sponsored book, did sponsor a really good, well-researched book about the history of Roadway, which is so important. I mean, it was a pioneer in what trucking is. And that one I'm aware of. I forget the title of it, but it's a book about Roadway. What's it? Motor Wagons. I don't know. Yeah, John Miller would know this question. That's Motor Wagons. So do you know who wrote that? Okay. Well, that's a different one that I'm talking about, but there's a book called Motor Wagons as well? Okay, about the trucking. Apparently the answer is yes. You're surrounded by librarians. Why are you asking me this question? When I worked at the Beacon Journal, people would look in the phone book and call up the front desk of the Beacon Journal and ask them any question, like it was a library reference desk. And it was like, part of me said, what are they thinking? And then part of me said, they must think we're the smartest people in the world. Like we know everything. So it felt good. And then, yeah. Over here, yes.
I haven't had a chance to read the book so far, but I'm curious about something as I scan through it, particularly after the comment you made about not remembering all the visits that you made to Thursday's Lounge. How do you remember all this back to your childhood? Do you keep a diary?
The question is, how do you remember all of the things that you write about? And I talk to my students I teach creative writing at the university, and we talk about that a lot. Because I come from a journalism background, there are a lot of people who write memoir and personal essay who feel like, that that their memory is their tool, and if they can't remember them, some of them feel free to embellish or to tell the story in a storytelling voice that kind of makes it easier to tell the story. And I feel like, again, because I come from a journalism background, that if I can't find a fact or clarify a memory, that I can't use it. So, like when I write about stuff from the past, it's, I interviewed my family about things when I was growing up, and I interviewed John about things that we experienced when we were experiencing Akron. And there's lots of ways to remember things, photographs and other records that exist in every family. So, and then the stuff that you can't remember, you don't get to use. So, I don't know. Yeah. So, yeah. Over here?
I just have a question, or not, I don't have a question. I just wanted to let you know, and I know I said this to you earlier, but I wasn't sure how I should have done, because I've read those books, like them, that it would be a slam on Akron, and I know you love the city. But I wasn't real sure, I'm not a native, so I wasn't sure how I would appreciate the book or if I would like it. And just for anybody who has not yet had a chance to read it, thank you.
Yeah.
It's
Thanks.
really nice. It's a funny book, and it's something that we will be able to be proud of as people who are from this area, and we go and people who don't know anything about us and they
And like all of the talent is leaving, all of these people left. And I'm thinking, okay, 33% left, 66% stayed. What's their story? And that seems to be what they're responding to, is who stays here and why, and in what seems to be a good way. So, yeah. Oh, I guess one more question over here.
So what are the contemporary things that excite you about Akron? Like things that you aren't currently involved in or are coming up to meet you as far as you're writing memoirs and memories of growing up when you're 17, there's various time changes, I'm sure, and stories.
What are the contemporary things that I'm excited about Akron? Well, like when I was a columnist, like I loved how weird Akron is, and how it's almost like sometimes would seem like if I looked at it with like a slightly jaundiced view, it would seem like another planet. Like I used to refer to it sometimes as Planet Akron. And I love the fact that that continues to evolve. So, like, there's a brand new blimp that I know all the, like, hardcore blimp geeks are going to get all, like, their panties in a bunch because it's got a rigid support inside, therefore it doesn't qualify as an actual blimp. Like, there's so many blimp weirdos in Akron that I just can't wait. I wish I was writing for the paper so I could just call it a blimp and just wait for the angry phone call from the guy in Springfield Township. And, you know, and now the baseball team's called the Rubber Ducks. And, like, one of the early designs of their uniforms, the word ducks didn't look like ducks. I just love when stuff like that happens. Yes?
I just want to thank you very much for coming.
I get to end on that note. Thank you so much. Thanks.